What's up? Alexander here with Date Psychology. So, taking a quick break from the Oxford Handbook of Evolutionary Psychology, the recent series that I'm doing, reviewing that. Going to discuss a new paper on life history strategies, some controversies about this, but also this will be a really good introduction, I think, to what it is, what life history strategies are, the fast, slow continuum, the basic model, the new extended model proposed by Marco del Guidis, I think. Let's see. So, this is the paper here, A Turning Point for the Life History Approach to Individual Differences by Marco del Guidis. I might be saying that wrong. I'm terrible with these things. This is what happens when you read things and you don't hear the word ever in real life, is you never say it correctly. Anyway, going on now. Life history strategy theory. What is it? So, very influential in evolutionary psychology. Based on this idea of a fast, slow paradigm of behavior and individual differences. We'll talk about that and what that means from Belsky and Steinberg back in 1991. This is kind of a developmental sequence or a cascade. So this is kind of the background of it here. The idea that stress and adversity shape parenting behavior. Then in turn, this shapes traits and behaviors, dispositions in offspring, right? Attachment styles, interpersonal dispositions, somatic differences, important here, like delayed or early puberty, the size of offspring. Are they short? Are they tall? Are they physically strong? Are they weak? Do they engage in certain behaviors earlier or later in life, such as, first sexual intercourse, that sort of a thing. Puberty timing in this basic thing mediates, I say, in the basic theory here of life history strategy. We'll get into puberty timing at the end, so keep that in mind. We're looking at the basic one here. Puberty timing mediates early expressions of traits. So, earlier puberty onset, an earlier age of sexual debut, the age at first sexual intercourse, couple stability down the line. Do people form long-term stable relationships or many short-term relationships? They break up, they can't stay together. As well as parental strategies. Do people invest a lot in offspring, high-quality offspring, high investment, or do they invest in kind of more offspring, right? So a lot of short-term sexual encounters, more offspring, but lower investment in those offspring. So life history strategies in that case. We're talking about strategies of fast versus slow reproduction and high versus low parental investment, right? Many versus few offspring. Many lower quality offspring, and you would measure this by something like birth weight versus fewer high quality offspring. So let's go on now to the next slide. Some things added to life history strategy down the road. 1993, 1999, Chisholm. So, sociosexual orientations, we've talked about that many times on this channel, right? A predisposition toward sexual variety, sexual novelty, the desire to seek out multiple sexual partners, attitudes toward casual sex. Are sociosexual orientations restricted or are they unrestricted, right? Or are they short-term versus long-term orientation? And as well, time preferences, okay? So outside of the mating domain. Are people more oriented toward immediate goals, like I want it right now, right? Inability to delay gratification, taking risks to get something in the moment, or future goals. Do they delay gratification, that sort of thing? Are they oriented toward goals in the future that they're working toward slowly, right? So fast versus slow, we see here. Fast, short-term seekers. Present orientation. Slow, long-term oriented toward future goals. So life history strategy, it was becoming more popular by about the mid-2010s. That's when the author of this paper says was kind of the peak in interest in this. But what happens when you see something become very popular in psychology? That's also when you get more scrutiny on it, more people are looking at it, more people are examining it. The replication crisis, people are trying to replicate papers and see like, what of these associations persists, what's right, what's wrong, that kind of a thing. So, questions about it, its theoretical soundness, how valid are the measurements of life history itself or measurements of associated dimensions or traits such as sociosexuality, actually a very good measurement, and some empirical links as well between what we should expect for life history theory, right? Because you have a theory and then you test associations, hypotheses that support that theory. So, if we say this is the theory, there are certain things we should expect, certain things we should not expect. So, associations between certain behavioral traits, between physical maturation, the age of that, and behavioral traits, between the reproductive strategies, fast and slow, the role of the early environment, that kind of a thing. So let us continue onward. So a turning point in life history theory, they talk about this paper, they point out many critiques. Here is another paper, another example. This is by Din and Gangstad, two of the authors that originated the dual mating hypothesis. They've done probably most of the research on ovulatory shifts, that sort of a thing. So also they're very involved in research on life history theory as well. So the title of this paper, Mating Fast and Slow, Sociosexual Orientations Are Not Reflective of Life History Trajectories. Title of the paper kind of tells you what the big critique is there. Is they're saying, okay, sociosexuality, fast versus slow life history strategies are not related to short versus long-term mating, right? So to reiterate, short-term mating doesn't predict fast life history strategies. Long-term mating does not predict slow life history strategies. We've tended to think of the two as almost synonymous, right? Like you're short-term mating oriented, you're a fast life history strategist. I know this is something I've said myself many times on this channel, but of course, new evidence, new debates, those kinds of things. I'm going to tell you that side of it as well. So fast, slow, it doesn't map on to short or long-term socioelectual orientation, right? According to this paper. It also doesn't reflect the mating versus the parental care trade-off, which is another big part of this, right? The idea that fast life history strategists, short-term mating orientations, they put forth more mating effort, right? They are mating oriented. They're spending a lot of time on mating effort. They're spending less time on somatic effort. So somatic effort being self-development, care of the self, acquiring resources for the self. Also, the parental care, right? Parental care and long-term orientation, not necessarily linked. So we think, the long-term slow life history strategist is going to be the one that invests more in parental care. They're saying that's not necessarily the case. The last point here, I seem to have cut it off, but sex with multiple partners also doesn't seem to predict this fast versus low life history behavior, or at least according to this paper, right? So this is kind of one of the recent critiques, right? This is very, very recent. This is from January of 2024. So well, actually the issue is from January. So going on now to the next slide. So back to the original paper, we're looking at the interplay here of psychology and demography, right? So we're looking at individual differences, traits within individuals, and then how those are expressed across a population as demographic trends. Sometimes these things don't always match up that well. High individual variation, high stochasticity, that sort of a thing. So life history strategies, they represent an allocation of goals, all sorts of things together, right? Long-term orientation, short-term orientation, parental investment, et cetera, et cetera. But the outcomes that individual organisms have in their lives, they're not just a function of allocation strategy, are they? So quality-oriented strategists with resources, they could still invest more in quantity. That's still something that could occur. This we expect to occur when resources in the environment improve, so caloric intake, that sort of a thing. Then you start to see individuals who are oriented both toward quality, right? Quality in a mate, quality in offspring, provisioning, and quantity-oriented strategies, they tend to invest more in quality and quantity both. So more resources in the environment open up the opportunities for both kinds of strategists to kind of prioritize both of these things more. And these strategies begin to diverge more when the trade-off becomes more severe. So it's in these resource-scarce environments that you probably begin to see more this traditional fast, slow life continuum of behavior, right? Where you have, okay, now it makes more sense to really follow a more strict fast life, more strict slow life, or whatever the case may be. So the image here at the bottom kind of shows the same allocation rules here, but what happens when resources change? Then you begin to see it diverge. You can see similar patterns for people that have fast and low life history strategies, or I should say you will see different patterns for individuals that have fast and low life history strategies, even though they're following these strategies simply based on the resources in the environment. So going on now to the next slide. Demographic life history traits, they're noisy, is what they say here. And what does that mean? There's a high degree of randomness as far as reproduction and death are concerned, which are two big parts of this life history strategy, right? Fast life history strategists, particularly non-human animals, these are animals with a very short lifespan. But randomness actually explains most of the variance and individual differences in these things in non-human animals. So this isn't to say that animals mate randomly, which we know they do not. As far as I know, there's not a single species that mates randomly. We've talked about this in past videos. But randomness does explain a lot of the variance here as far as when organisms die, when they reproduce, reproductive fitness, that sort of thing. So because there's a lot of randomness, this also means we shouldn't expect to see very large correlations between life history traits, right? Or individual traits that predict overall life history strategies. or, with their behavioral correlates in that case, right? So if not measuring life history strategy directly, measuring the traits that correlate with that. It also means that individual psychological traits, they can show trade-offs in life history strategy, perhaps better than measuring the strategies themselves, okay? So you have measurements of life history strategy, the mini K scale or something like that. You might actually see better correlations, better relationships if you look at kind of like a constellation of traits that predict these things, which we're going to kind of talk about. So, in other words, the overall life history patterns, they can look differently from the individual traits or behaviors that constitute them, right? So you can see someone that has perhaps a lot of traits that seem to be indicative of a slow life history strategy, but you look at kind of their life or whatever, how things are going for them, it looks much more like a fast life or whatever. So, next slide here. There's some modern challenges to measuring life history. That's due to evolutionary mismatch, right? The ancestral environment that we evolved in, very different from the modern environment. So we see people engage in behaviors, particularly across mating preferences, but all sorts of things as well, that would have been adaptive in past environments that don't necessarily seem to make a lot of sense in the modern environment. So one example of that is that sex and mating don't always predict reproductive success very well, right? And why is that? Well, abortion and contraceptives, a good example, people can have a lot of sex and not necessarily reproduce. Not necessarily the case in past ancestral environments, not the case with animals, right? That if they're having a lot of sex, they're probably going to have higher fertility, have more children, they're going to get pregnant, that kind of a thing. Now what do we see? Individuals that have more children, they simply tend to have a desire to have more children. So it's very deliberate. These are people that have that desire. It's a conscious thought, but also it's a disposition. So there's unconscious motivations there. Some people want to have kids a lot, others just don't. So dispositions toward long-term commitments and a willingness to invest time is also predictive of this, right? So it's not just people that want to have kids, but it's also people that think like, I want to get married, I want to have a family, I want to commit to someone and help raise those children, etc., etc. Fewer children, of course, desire to have fewer children. And people with multiple partners, they can still have fewer children in the modern environment because of things like birth control, abortion, everything that we're able to kind of control reproductively in a modern environment. So this does mean when observing these correlations in modern environments and that sort of a thing, fast life history strategies can still have low, null, or negative correlations with reproductive outcomes, right? So someone can have a very fast life history strategy. You might not see a very large correlation with number of offspring, simply because, they're using birth control or whatever the case may be. Next slide. So resources still play an important role in the modern environment, right? Perhaps even more than in past environments as far as reproductive goes. That's one of the big reasons people cite for not wanting to have kids is like, it's expensive, I can't afford it, I need to focus on my career. So that is prioritizing somatic goals over reproductive goals in that case. So an access to more resources in the modern environment allows people to have more children and also allows them to actually have children earlier as well. So these are things that you would associate more children and earlier children with a fast life history strategy, but in the modern environment, if resource acquisition, which is more associated, with slow life history strategy, produces this, you see kind of a confound, don't you there? So this is true kind of despite that underlying allocation of life history strategy. So given that, we can't necessarily characterize demographic patterns of early and late reproduction as fast, low, or fast and slow life history strategies because this can be confounded by other things within the modern environment, right? Energetic or caloric abundance in the environment, it can also erroneously produce what looks like a fast life history strategy at the population level, kind of what I explained. So if resources, good nutrition, that sort of a thing produce at the population level earlier birth, you might look at the population and compare it to another and think, oh, this is a very fast life history population, when in fact it's not. It could be a Western population or something like that. Mortality, on the other hand, it still does predict most things associated with fast or low life history strategies. As I mentioned, slow life history strategy, earlier mortality, fast life history strategy, later mortality. Why is that? Well, we know one thing associated with slow life history, with fast life history strategists is risk taking, right? So more risk for death, that kind of thing. This is still a robust association that mortality at the demographic level predicts things that are associated with fast and slow life history strategies. Let's go on now. The mating and parenting trade-off here. So, what do we know about human beings? We've talked about this many, many times on this channel. Human beings are extreme investors in offspring. Many animals, most mammals even, do not pair bond. They don't invest very much in the offspring, especially males, right? So given that, we should expect this offspring mating trade-off to be really important, right? How much time is invested in offspring, in committed relationships, long-term relationships, by parental care, and how much time is devoted to mating? How much mating effort is expended? Investment is best, as far as the investment you can provide in offspring, it seems to be best facilitated by forming stable long-term relationships, right? We're a species that evolved for biparental care. And one of the very big things, across all of the research in relationship science and all of that we know jeopardizes long-term relationship formation is the pursuit of other mates, right? Infidelity, that kind of a thing. Investing resources in other mates, time in other mates, not dedicating time or attention to the current relationship, etc. So we see this trade-off, right? Mating effort, and mating effort is not just like, I think a lot of people when they hear this, they think about like, single guy looking for a mate, how much time is he spending? Mating effort is also like the willingness to cheat when you're already in a relationship and stuff like that. So anyway, this trade-off is especially important for men, and that's because men have a longer fertility window, right? Men have more opportunities to sire offspring as well within the same time frame, right? Because when a woman gets pregnant, she's pregnant. She can't get pregnant at least within that window until she can again. A man, on the other hand, conceivably could father multiple offspring, in the span of a week with different women. So we would expect this trade-off to be especially important for men. Mating effort, in that sense, is more beneficial to men, has diminishing returns to women, and perhaps that's related to why we see big sex differences in sociosexuality. Men devote more to mating effort, right? That kind of a thing. But mating effort in women, it could still be used to attain investment for multiple partners. So it's not like it's completely meaningless for women. Anyway, next slide. So the author of this paper, Del Guidis, proposes that the mating parenting trade-off is the core of human life history strategies, right? Now, past models here might have proposed something different, that the core is sociosexuality, or that the core is the onset of puberty. We'll get into those things a little bit, but that's kind of what we're looking at here, this extended model. The mating parenting trade-off is kind of the core of these human life history strategies, and that it's what organizes all of these other traits. They're all kind of organized around this. So, Din and Gangstad, we looked at the second paper here, critiquing this. They say no, this is kind of where they disagree, right? And they give some examples of this. And we'll look at some examples and some rebuttals in the current paper, because this current paper is also a response to that. So they point out in birds, they have more investment. They also have higher reproductive success, right? So, we expect investment, life history theory, to be associated with fewer offspring. In birds, we see the opposite, right? That birds who have more biparental care have higher reproductive success or more offspring. But as the author of the current paper says, this is actually lower for birds whose offsprings have longer periods of dependency. So that might be the case across the board, but then you look at birds that need more parental care, and then you see the typical life history strategy thing, right? Where it's like, they need more care, so the pair of these birds that have to provide longer biparental care, they have fewer offspring. Development offspring, or the offspring development and parental care here, they have to be considered kind of together. How long is the trajectory of the development of that offspring? So high reproductive output in this case alone, it's not just synonymous with a fast life history strategy. Important to remember. Reproductive effort, yeah, it is. But, right, the mating effort versus parenting trade-off. But output itself, the number of kids, it's not something you can just look at and be like, yeah, fast, slow life history strategy. Anyway, next one. So another objection that Din and Gangstad make, monogamy is not actually related to offspring production, including in primates, that sort of a thing. So there's not a quantity versus quality kind of difference in monogamy here. So it's not necessarily the case that animals that have better biparental care, that form monogamous unions, actually have higher quality offspring when you look at something like offspring weight. How do you measure the quality of offspring in animals? I don't know. You have to look at measures of physical health in that sense, right? The size and all of that, because those reflect care, resource provisioning, the abundance of resources in the environment, caloric intake, that kind of thing. But monogamy is also not necessarily linked with parental care. Here's how we have kind of the rejoinder, the rebuttal in that sense. Some monogamous primates, they don't have any parental care. They give some examples there. Some promiscuous primates, they still form stable pair bonds despite being much more promiscuous. Chimpanzees, pretty promiscuous, but they also have some mix here, close human ancestor. They have some degree where they have shared parental care. So pair bonding here and parental care, they might not actually be that closely linked with one another. So we can't actually use monogamy as a proxy for parenting effort over mating effort. But this is looking at animals, right? The important thing is that it's predictive in humans. So let's go on to the next slide and see what else we're looking at. Din and Gangstad here, they said in human foragers, a greater contribution to subsistence predicts higher fertility, right? So higher investment, higher fertility, right? That's kind of what we see in human foragers, right? Again, contrary to what we might expect, where lower investment is associated with higher fertility. So what we actually see, the most reproductively successful dyads or pair bonds or men or whatever the case may be, they have both kind of quality of offspring and quantity of offspring. But something that Delguidis in the current paper says is stability in foragers, what we actually see is that it's greatest when male investment is intermediate. So in situations like this, the fathers, they don't contribute zero to the offspring, but nor do they contribute all of the calories. So you have some kind of intermediate level of parental care here. Fertility isn't just the result of committed pair bonds alone in this case. There's other factors that play into it, right? So it's not just necessarily like the more the father provides, the higher the fertility will be. There's other things. What resources are available in the environment, the role of alloparenting, right? Their extended family, to what extent are they also provisioning all of that? So some other research as well. Pathogen preference or presence, right? The presence of pathogens in the environment, disease, it is associated with fast life history strategy, and investment in these environments is associated with higher quality offspring as well. So here we see some things that are kind of consistent with it, right? Let's go on now to the next slide. So looking at Din and Gangstad again, they say that unrestricted sociosexuality poses a risk to long-term investment, right? True. So there's a cost to reproductive fitness that we should expect, right? That the more there is seeking mates outside of the relationship, the more it might cost reproductive fitness by jeopardizing that relationship. And this is, of course, assuming that in pair bonds, long-term relationships have higher reproductive fitness, kind of like they were talking about that. So they say it's unlikely to have evolved kind of as a fast life history strategy. But Delguidis says, serial monogamy can also be interpreted as a fast life history strategy. It's not just, permanent pair bonding across the lifespan. It's also, it can go from one partner to another partner to another partner. And that can also have benefits to fitness. And you could interpret that as a fast life history strategy to some extent. Divorce, what we see, it's more common early in marriages, for example, and we're talking about, what we tend to think of as long-term relationships. And multiple marriages, they increase reproductive fitness. So I think they looked at some hunter-gatherer groups in this paper to reference this, but yeah, marriages that end earlier in divorce, those women tend to have higher reproductive fitness, right? So they're having more children, and by more men in that case. So more mating effort and having multiple partners, there are examples of how this can actually increase fitness. It's not necessarily the case that, unrestricted sociosexuality actually results in reduced fertility in all of these cases. It doesn't necessarily result in reduced provisioning either. They cite the Himba as an example of that, kind of an interesting culture here where there's kind of this open polygamy. There's very high rates of extra pair parenting. And what do we see? That Himba men, they still provide resources to their extra pair children, right? So to the women that they fathered with other women, even though those other women are actually married themselves and have a provider, that kind of a thing. So there can still be provisioning benefits even for short-term mating. And they also say there's, what Din and Gangstad propose here is kind of a hypothesis at this point. There's not a lot of data to support that unrestricted sociosexuality actually poses a risk to long-term investment, or at the very least, if it might propose a risk to long-term investment, but that it doesn't necessarily cost reproductive fitness. Anyway, going on now to the next slide. Din and Gangstad point out that there's no link between sociosexuality and reproductive timing in women, okay? So, the age of first birth, which is part of kind of this fast, slow life history strategy, we expect reproductive timing to be earlier in the fast life history strategist, and we expect more unrestricted sociosexuality. That's kind of the title of the paper. They say there's not really a link here. So the rejoinder being made here is, allocation strategies are not determined just by single traits. Just because we don't see a correlation between these two variables doesn't mean that we don't see a correlation between this whole constellation of life history traits, right? And life history in general, that kind of a thing. Multiple traits working together, working against each other, randomness, as we mentioned, these can kind of reduce the relationship between single traits and kind of obscure the relationship that exists there when you look at, bivariate correlations. Anyway, going on to the next slide. So, constellations of life history traits. as we kind of mentioned in the past slide, we can't just look at individual traits and say fast, slow life history. We have to kind of look at this constellation of traits together, all of these things. So, core life history traits, what are they? Present versus future orientation, kind of mentioned this, right? Risk-taking, sensation-seeking, what is that? Fast life history strategy associated with more risk-taking, more sensation-seeking, and a future orientation. Slow life history strategy associated with the reverse, risk aversion, that kind of a thing. So we see earlier versus delayed onset of sexual desire, right? So this is going to be like age of first intercourse, but also the age of first interest in sex, that kind of a thing. Restricted versus unrestricted sociosexuality is part of the basic model here as well, right? A desire for sexual novelty in many partners, and long versus short-term mating, that kind of a thing. Disgust sensitivity is another one, okay? So we know this is a personality trait where some people have higher disgust sensitivity if it's disgust of pathogens and also sexual disgust, right? Taboos and also moral disgust, rule violations is something we see. So fast life history strategist, lower sexual disgust, lower moral disgust, lower pathogen disgust, that kind of a thing, right? And exploitative versus cooperative attitudes, right? So the fast life history strategy is associated with exploitative attitudes, which probably is also associated with something like immediate gratification. Cooperative social attitudes, on the other hand, associated with the slow life history strategy. So together, the picture here. Slow life history strategy, what is it? Safe strategies and long-term strategies. Fast life history strategy, what is it? Risky strategies, short-term strategies for life across the board, not just mating, right? Important to remember. Personality traits as well, from the Big Five or the Hexaco or something like that, they're also associated with life history strategy. So the author says motivation, probably even more than that, is associated with life history strategy than personality traits. So you have personality traits, but you also have kind of motivational attitudes, right? Like how much do you want to do this? How much do you want to do that? Anyway, going on now to the next slide. Here you can see an image. This kind of shows the constellation of these traits and the kinds of associations that we see. In the next slide, I'll explain it, but I just wanted to kind of put this image up because I think it can kind of help you visualize, like, yeah, this is a web of interconnected traits, right, that predict fast and slow life history strategies. Let's go on now to the next slide. These constellations, what are the correlations? You probably couldn't see it that well in the past image. So an earlier age of sexual debut, right, earlier sexual intercourse, what's it associated with, correlated with, right? Impulsivity, sensation-seeking, unrestricted sociosexuality, having more sexual partners, and more risk-taking. So this early age of sexual debut is associated with all of these other fast life history strategy things. Personality traits, we mentioned that. What sort of correlations would we see here? Low agreeableness, low honesty, humility, and low conscientiousness associated with fast life history traits. Earlier sexual debut, having more sexual partners, and having a higher chance of having an early pregnancy, right? Antisocial behavior, what is that associated with? Again, fast life history strategy things. Here we see genetic correlations with early reproduction and increased fertility, okay? So having an earlier maternal age at birth. So your mother is younger when she has you, right? What is that correlated with in offspring? Having more sexual partners, having lower self-control, and also more externalizing behaviors, right? So more pathologies, things like anxiety disorders in that case. And the externalizing factor, kind of this association between different pathologies. More sexual partners, earlier sexual debut, more risk-taking behaviors, more antisocial behavior, and more pregnancies, so higher fertility in that case. A lot of these show genetic correlations. They're not just behavioral or environmental correlations. So they're less confounded by the environment in that case and by, things unique to the modern environment. Let's go on now to the next slide. Some genetic correlations of life history traits, just kind of mentioning this. So we have this horizontal pleiotropy, right? And that's where a genetic variant can influence two or more traits. So when I say some of these are genetically correlated, that's what we see here is kind of this horizontal pleiotropy. That a genetic variant in this thing can be like, okay, this here is causal both for early sexual debut and for risk-taking. If I remember correctly, I think that's actually an example of one. Vertical pleiotropy, that produces some other correlations. So a genetic variant produces another first trait, which in turn influences a second one. So an example here, earlier sexual debut results in women having earlier pregnancies and then more sexual partners, okay? So that's the important takeaway from this one briefly. The correlations are not just produced solely by the environment. True for most things in personality psychology, right? This is developmental, so the environment is important. The developmental environment is important, but also heritability is important. Let's go on now to the next slide. So, an extended model of fast, slow life history strategies. What we have described so far is essentially the basic model, kind of what everyone's been working with this. The current author, Marco Del Guidis, is proposing an extended model, kind of looking at this a little bit differently, but still kind of the same traits, right? So not that differently, but let's see what we're looking with here. I really kind of like this extended model. So allocations to mating and parenting, they can be realized through different pathways, right? So mating effort, right? Fast life history strategy kind of thing can be acted upon or expressed differently through different pathways. And the same for allocation to parental investment, right? So this can favor like different combinations of behaviors and traits, right? There's different pathways to the same goal, basically, is kind of a way to think about it. So let's take an example here. Provisioning for offspring. You think about that, like what does it mean to provision for your offspring? Well, you could give them money. You could be a completely absent father, but you're rich, so you can take care of a lot of offspring. You can hire them nannies and that sort of thing. So you can provision for offspring without doing like any direct parental care as a father, right? Or you could be poor, but you could just be a very attentive father and a really good father and be there, and you're taking them to baseball games and that sort of a thing. Protection, right? Are you there physically? Are you able to hire armed guards or whatever the case may be? So there's different pathways here. These are just examples of two. There's not like these are the only two or whatever, but transmitting wealth, little direct care, or lots of direct care. Both are provisioning strategies, slow life history strategies, pathways toward investment in offspring, high levels of investment, but they look pretty different from one another. Let's go on now to the next one. So another example here. Humans have a dual status hierarchy. I think I've talked about this in some of my earlier videos. Henrik and Gil White, right? This is also a really interesting topic to look up. Dominance and prestige, these two pathways to status in human societies. Dominance, what is it? Almost just physical force. Status is achieved through dominating others physically, often in contest competitions, in an ancestral environment or something like that, probably. Prestige, on the other hand, it's when an individual is granted status kind of voluntarily by all of the other peoples. He's elected, that kind of a thing. Typically of these two, what do we see helps people maintain status in primates like chimpanzees and in hunter-gatherer groups and all of that? Typically the prestige seems to be much more stable and also kind of, I guess, better in some sense. But prestige, what does it mean? Status is attained by skills, knowledge, contribution to the group, right? You are high status because everyone thinks you're high status. You're not just high status because they're afraid of getting beat up by you. So this also means that the benefits of status can be transmitted in different ways to offspring, right? Did you inherit, the gang from the warlord, or, are you the son of the man that everyone loves, whatever the case may be. The point being that fast, low life strategies here won't just be a single set of traits, and both of these, dominance and prestige, can also reflect fast versus slow, right? Dominance, immediate gratification, impulsivity. That is a way that individuals with fast life history strategies tend to exert or gain status. And often, when I said prestige is better, it's because these dominance strategies often tend to be very fleeting, right? You have to maintain dominance for a long period of time, and that's what you see kind of in more aggressive chimpanzees. What happens? The others gang up and they take him down. Who's the chimpanzee that stays at the high rank, the largest? He's not the most aggressive, but he kind of maintains peace between the other ones. So prestige, on the other hand, associated, slow life history strategy. These are things that keep you valuable and appreciated for a long, long period of time. Let's go on now to the next slide. I like this image a lot. I don't know if you're going to be able to see it, but I'll kind of explain. Well, this is mostly what we've explained, but if you can, pause it and look at it or something. This is the basic model, what they have here, which is just, a continuum left to right, fast versus slow. But they add on that with the extended model, right? And so there's different dimensions here. For fast life history strategies, there's an antagonistic or exploitative strategy, okay? So exploiting others, immediate gratification, that kind of a thing. But there's also a seductive or creative fast life history strategy, right? For immediate gain, that kind of a thing. Mentalistic cognition, higher verbal ability, higher creativity, actually lower in aggression, negatively correlated with aggression, whereas the antagonistic exploitative one correlated with aggression, and then also positively correlated with openness, right? So if you think like something like openness in the big five, what do we know? Yeah, that's associated with having more sexual partners, also with imagination, creativity, aesthetics. So these are things that can produce, kind of benefits, status benefits through the prestige pathway. On the other hand, what do we see here for slow life history strategies, right? These two dimensions. There's a pro-social or caregiving one, and then there's a skilled or provisioning one, okay? So pro-social, caregiving. Think of the idea of someone who's just a very good and committed partner, and he's good at caregiving and taking care of the kids, and you like being around him, and he's highly empathetic, and you're like, I love my partner so much, he's great. Then think of a skilled and provisioning one, where it's like, okay, he's a little distant, and he's cold, he's lower in empathy and that sort of a thing, lower in affiliation, so we don't have as close of a relationship, but he's very competent, and he's high status, and he provides really well, so he's the good provider. So that's kind of what you have there. It's kind of like the good bonder, and then like the good provider, as far as these slow history strategies go. Anyway, going on now to the next slide. The basic versus the extended model here. So in the basic model, fast life history strategy, what do we have here? It's antagonistic, exploitative, these dominance competitions, and it's associated with psychopathy, antisocial behaviors. In the extended model, this fast life history, then we add that other dimension, don't we? Where there's that kind of creative, mentalizing aspect of it, right? So higher verbal skills, mentalizing, creativity. Here's where you see a prestige competition, right? So the dominance competition fast, the prestige competition fast as well, but expressed differently. And here, when you see that associated with fast life history traits, you're going to be more likely to see that associated with narcissism, schizotypy, or something like that. And then in the basic model, slow life history strategy, which was just provisioning, right? So direct investment, nurturing, affiliation, that kind of a thing. Now in the extended model, it adds this other one, right? Which is kind of like skill-based, mechanistic-based, right? So resource contribution mainly in that case. Mastery of skills, a lower affiliation and empathy with the partner, but enhanced ability kind of to contribute, enhanced intelligence, but lower imagination in that case. They say this is actually associated with autism spectrum disorders. And another thing they said in this paper is that this second pathway probably emerged after the agricultural revolution, when people are able to acquire resources, right? When people are settled down in a spot, they're able to acquire resources. So this kind of might be kind of a newer pathway here. Anyway, so some differences between the basic and extended model and the way that both fast and slow life history strategies can be expressed in ways that look a little bit different from one another. So going on now. Puberty timing, we mentioned this at the beginning, and remember, this was something that in the basic model was kind of supposed to be pretty important to fast, slow life history strategists. We really expect with the fast life history strategy to have an earlier onset of puberty, but something that Dan and Gangstad mentioned was it's not actually clear that that's the case, that association isn't there. So, environmental effects can confound genetic effects here, right? You're going to have a delayed onset of puberty if the environment is poor, right? And that can produce delayed reproduction, but that's not evidence of a slow life history strategy. That's produced by the environment there. In fact, in environments that are resource scarce, we actually expect people, to deviate more in their slow, fast life history strategy. So we have kind of a confound there. And then, according to Marco Delguidis here, maybe puberty timing is just not that important or central to fast, slow life history strategies at all, like was proposed initially. Maybe it's not the most important thing, Why would it be? It doesn't have to be, right? We can modify the theory as needed. So there's multiple trade-offs here to puberty timing, right? Bodily growth, tissue maintenance, that kind of a thing. Earlier puberty, right? Kind of cuts off the growth of the body over time. Tissue maintenance, though, it also conserves that. So that's what you see there is that, earlier puberty occurs in resource scarce environments where it's like, I can't really develop any further. What happens to individuals in those environments? They're shorter, that sort of a thing. So what happens if someone is shorter, for example? That's not, super advantageous for men. So these environments also constrain the kinds of reproductive strategies that men can engage in, right? Fast, slow, whatever the case may be. There's a long reproductive window as well for human beings. This is kind of important to consider in this. That having an earlier timing for puberty, it might be really important if you are an animal that lives, 4 years or something like that. You're a bird, you're a sugar glider, you live 4 years. It's like, whoa, you have an extra few months that can really enhance your fertility. Not necessarily the case in human beings who live for many, many decades and have this really long reproductive window, especially for men who, have a reproductive window that lasts until they're quite old. So that probably reduces the importance of early fertility in human beings. And so maybe we shouldn't be looking at, puberty timing or early fertility as a big deal as far as fast, slow life history strategies go. Let's go on now to the next one. So puberty and some life history traits. What else do we see here? Another reason why we might want to discount puberty is kind of an important criticism, okay? Doesn't seem to be that closely associated with most life history traits, according to Delguidis here. There are some small causal relationships with first sexual debut and age of first birth, however. So, but puberty timing, there's not with fertility or sociosexuality or number of sexual partners. Some small associations with antisocial and risky behaviors, but these are probably not causal, right? So rather than being horizontal pleiotropy, they're vertical pleiotropy. But in these non-Western societies, puberty onset, it can be more important. So, in favor kind of that criticism of Din and Gangstead there. We look at, a lot of these correlations in Western environments, modern environment, it's very different. Sometimes we like to look at non-Western groups, right? Hunter-gatherers, foragers, that kind of thing, because we think, maybe they resemble more of a model of what our ancestors looked like, or what, an ancestral environment might have looked like. So ancestrally, puberty timing in girls, they probably did help to regulate the onset of reproduction. Individuals, there's kind of a myth that people didn't live a long time in the past. People kind of did still live a long time nonetheless, but probably a little bit shorter than, in modern Western countries. But ancestrally, puberty timing in girls would have helped to regulate the onset of reproduction in response to resource environment, right? I say resource environment, I say resource availability in the environment, right? Energy, calories, that kind of a thing. But what does Delguidis say in response to that? Well, there's kind of this U-shaped risk with mortality and early puberty in girls, right? So something we know about mortality, as mentioned in the beginning, it is associated with these life history expressions, right? That earlier mortality, fast life history strategy. You live longer, you got a slow life history strategy, on average, that kind of a thing. What do we actually see with early puberty, right? Well, there's a U-shaped risk. So sometimes early puberty is associated with earlier mortality. Sometimes early puberty is associated with later mortality. Hard to know what this really says about ancestral environments or how we should interpret something like that. Well, let's go on now to the next slide. So the time, puberty, throw it out the window or whatever the case may be. We're saying it's not that important in this paper. Onset of puberty, whatever. What is important then? What might we look for as kind of like crucial or more important here? The timing of sexual debut. At what age do individuals have their first sexual intercourse, or at what age do individuals begin feeling sexual desire, that kind of thing? Sexual awakening, right? The beginning of sexual motivation, because remember, motivational things, attitudes seem to be pretty important for this. So this kind of early sexual debut or later sexual debut, it can be kind of a node in the development of these fast and slow life history strategies, right? This does correlate with all of these traits much better. So correlates with unrestricted sociosexuality. They have an earlier sexual debut, more sexual partners, higher risk taking as well, higher fertility as well, and earlier age at first birth. So this is a causal effect in some of these cases on many of these, that actually having earlier sexual debut is what causes some of these other behaviors down the line. So that's why it's kind of a node in this. That's why it's kind of important. It's like, okay, you have, developmental trajectory, allocation of resources, producing, early or late sexual debut, and then that goes on to influence other things. But it's not just purely environmental. There's heritability here. We know that actually there's a pretty substantial environmental contribution to this, 20 to 40%, about as much as there is genetic in this case. So, it's pretty much genetic. Nature and nurture, what is it? Like many things, it's both. And in this case, it's both, which is what we expect with life history strategy, because it's an expression of your genes, your personality, and that sort of thing, but it's also a developmental marker. So your developmental environment influences that, right? So the age of sexual debut here, it could be a better marker of life history strategy than puberty timing, one of many things, but one thing to consider, maybe puberty timing in the critique, of Din and Gangstad is not that important, but we should be looking at early sexual debut instead. So, going on, that is it, guys. Last slide. Hope you liked the video. I hope this was a good introduction to, life history theory strategies, that kind of a thing. Introduction to that, and also, kind of where the research is now. This is the big debate being had in evolutionary psychology on this. Like, what does it mean? What are these things? So, hope you liked the video. Next video, we'll get back to the Oxford Handbook of Evolutionary Psychology and romantic relationships. But in the meantime, like the video, subscribe to the channel, hit the bell, and we have a Patreon. Join, help support the channel. I will make another video for you very soon.